everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight for our Green New Deal Town Hall. My name is Gabrielle Griffiths. I work as the Outreach Coordinator for Wellfleet Public Library. As a public library, our mission is to provide free access to information and a space for people to meet and engage in conversation. To paraphrase William Eshelman, the library's role isn't to tell people how to vote or what opinions to hold, but to provide people with a range of views on issues so that people can make up their own minds. Our goal is to provide as many points of view as possible on current issues. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who made this event possible. Our panelists, Montana Bailey, Ben Fairbank, Gordon Starr, and Madhavi Venkatesan. The Wellfleet Public Library, the Sunrise Movement, Massachusetts Climate Action Network, 350 Cape Cod, Sustainable Practices, Protect Our Cape Cod Aquifer, Youth Against Plastic Pollution. Thank you to our director, Jennifer Workin, an outstanding advocate of public discourse, our media operations manager, Mia Baumgarten, for filming, and our assistant director, Naomi Robbins, who curates the Wellfleet Public Library's seed library and who stuffed over 100 seed packets for each of you to take home tonight. If you haven't looked at the back of your seed packet already, the back label should read one of two quotes. As librarians, we get to read and recommend a lot of great books. I chose these quotes because I think they get to the heart of why we're here tonight. First, because nature isn't a commodity, but a community. And second, Planet Earth is a Dr. Seuss book made real. We wanted to give out seeds for a few reasons. 1, seeds are literal tools for climate action. 11% of all global greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans are caused by deforestation, comparable to the emissions from all of the cars and trucks on the planet. 2, seeds have the power to provide food, shelter, and oxygen for the community of living beings. Tropical rainforests cover 6 to 7 of the Earth's surface and contain over half of all the planet and animal species in the world. Or, on a more local level, one oak tree can provide shelter and food for over 530 different types of insects, which feeds countless birds and other wildlife. And 3, our words and our actions are seeds. What are we planting for future generations? What is the collective story we are writing? The Green New Deal is a platform that seeks to address the greatest issues of our time: social inequality and climate change. In 2,300 words, the resolution proposes the United States cuts greenhouse gas emissions by transforming our energy, agricultural, and economic systems and makes millions of jobs in the process. Tonight, as a community, we are writing a story, using our many viewpoints to ask the question, what does the Green New Deal mean to us? What would it look like in our community? According to Rainforest Action Network, the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet consumes more than 30% of the world's paper. One way we can help prevent the destruction of trees and production of greenhouse gas emissions is by using and supporting our local library, which, besides being one of the last free public spaces for democratic discourse, helps reduce fossil fuel and resource consumption by sharing books and other materials. To briefly go over our agenda, tonight our goal is to hear from as many people as possible. In the first part of our program, we will hear from our 4 panelists who will speak for 10 minutes each. In the second half of the program, we will open it up to everyone to ask the panelists questions and to share their thoughts and stories. To maximize the number of people heard, each speaker has allotted 2 minutes maximum to speak. We have a lot of environmental groups present tonight, so I invite everyone to stick around after the program to plant seeds, make new connections, and learn about how to get involved in organizations who are already working to make planet and people-friendly policies a reality at the state and local level. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first panelist of the evening, Benjamin Fairbank.
Thank you, everybody. Can we get these top lights? Yeah, thanks. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I guess just to echo that, I would start by saying that the 4 of us got together and had a really spirited conversation with Gabrielle, just intersecting our various backgrounds and just having a very multifaceted dialogue about this. And kind of the purpose with what we want to do is to share that with you and to include you in that conversation and to just stimulate your thinking that you can then go back to the people in your circles and you can have conversation with them, and it's a really good thing. So again, my name is Ben Fairbank. I am an ecological designer and consultant, and I'm going to provide a little bit of historical and ecological context for the Green New Deal. So we have a lot of problems that we have to deal with and we're trying to face, and it's almost mind-numbing to think of just how many issues we have. So it kind of helps, I think, when you just take each issue and just go one at a time. Climate change has so many systemic risks involved. Some of them are caused by extreme weather. Shifting climate zones are displacing a lot of habitat. And it also is changing zones that affect agriculture throughout the world, and then just the kind of domino effect that it goes from there. And I will say, I assume that a lot of people here are very educated on this, and so it's just kind of brushing over those things, and forgive me if I say something that you are very well aware of, but the other huge issues we're dealing with are water quality, air quality, and then of course environmental justice, and making sure that we're thinking about all the necessary stakeholders for what we're dealing with. So just a quick overview. I think a lot of the country was very woken up by Hurricane Sandy. It was the largest storm of its kind. 175-mile radius, which was never seen before for a Category 2. And a lot of damage, a lot of human toll, and I guess that was the beginning of when we were thinking about maybe we should think about this. And the more recent disaster was Camp Fire last year, which was, as we all know, the largest wildfire in California history, with a lot of damage done. And just kind of looking at some data about climate change. As we progress into the 21st century, climate zones are changing. So you can see where the red is. This is kind of the Maple Beach birch habitat, and you can just see as with higher emissions, that is all the way up here, and you lost all that habitat for Pennsylvania, which then converts to oak hickory habitat. So over the course of the next 100 years, we're going to be experiencing a lot of change in climate, which then has a domino effect on a lot of the wildlife, especially migratory birds. If you look at the yellow line right here at the bottom, that's where it is now. That's where the summer regional habitat for a lot of these migratory birds are. And as you progress to 2080, you can just see that drift up slowly. And the problem with this is that a lot of these species, which are migrating all as far away as South America, they want to go back to the same fields every year. And when these, when they come back and it's a different climate that they're not accustomed to, that can have a huge effect, because then they have to go find a new field, and it can just totally knock off of balance the entire food web. And I guess we're just hearing from the UN that we're on track for 1 million species to be eradicated, which is very distressing here, to say the least. But of course, this is not just about climate change. We have a lot of other environmental issues. There's water quality. Residents of Cape Cod are well aware of that. This is mostly caused by stormwater, but there's also the problem of septics. So we really need to come up with some creative solutions to solve these problems. And this is very distressing too, to see that childhood asthma is increasing as a result of climate change. So we really need to just look at this with our eyes wide open and cast a really wide net and make sure that we're looking at this with eyes wide open. So what I wanted to start out with just talking about the New Deal, because if we're going to add the word green to it, maybe let's understand the beginning. That fateful day on October 29th when the stock market crashed caused a lot of panic and a lot of financial loss. But there was another menace that was hidden in the country that was disguised as economic productivity. And to describe that, we have to understand the bread lines. And I want to give everybody a pop quiz. What's the staple crop that you need for bread? Wheat. Right. Good job. So there have been a number of innovations at this time, and people were fleeing to the Great Plains, and they were producing wheat. The innovation of the disc tiller brought it to a kind of a mass production rate. And then, unfortunately, when the Great Depression hit, everybody needed food, and usually when the demand goes up, the price goes up. But in this case, the price went down because nobody had any money. And so basically, they just saw this as an opportunity to just double their product. And so what entailed was the Great Plains started being totally over-harvested. And just to give you an example of what we're looking at here, to the left, go back. Okay, so to the left is a perennial native prairie grass, and you can just see the root system. And to the right is agricultural wheatgrass, so which is an annual. In this case, it's an annual. So you can see that with when you have a field like this where it's all annual agricultural wheat, and there's nothing to hold that soil together, it's going to cause a really bad situation. And so then what followed was 10 years of the Dust Bowl, no rain for almost an entire decade. Those roots, which were previously holding the soil together, were allowing these huge dust storms to take place. And it was so bad that people were waking up with sand in their ears, even if their doors were closed, and their decks were being covered in sand. And it was basically rendering the economy of the Great Plains obsolete, as this wheat farming was their sole economy at the time. And so there's really a lot to deal with. It wasn't just the rest of the country suffering, but there were people that were actually starving out in the Great Plains. So moving on from that, FDR obviously knew that there was a lot of pain that was being experienced, and so this is a picture of him outlining his ideas of the New Deal in 1933. And so this is just a list of some of the acts during the New Deal. I've highlighted here in green some of the legislation that is mostly environmental related, as they kind of responded to a lot of these environmental problems back then. And this just kind of shows you that FDR really wasn't just trying to put a Band-Aid on anything. He was actually trying to look at this from a systemic approach. So figuring out new strategies for a sustainable way to farm wheatgrass, terracing to retain water and not overuse the water in the area. And that's kind of a result of that. And also the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service, which basically surveyed almost the entirety of the country to figure out different soil types and what they could use for better productivity and sustainability. You had the Roosevelt Tree Army that went all throughout the Great Plains, planting trees and windbreaks, which were holding the soil together. And in addition to all these sustainable measures, they also incorporated a lot of big public works projects. So we think of the Tennessee Valley Authority and those kinds of things. And basically the solution that everyone came up with was we need irrigation. We need to drill wells, we need to build dams, and we need to hold all our water together so that we can actually overcome any kind of a future Dust Bowl situation. And so that's the legacy of the New Deal. And so now when we look at the landscape from above, this is from NASA, you have these circles that are caused by those rotating irrigators that apparently do reduce water consumption by 33%, but it's still, there's all you have are those monocultural crops and very little habitat. And so this just goes to show that we actually have solved the erosion problem. This is in 1982. The blue is from water erosion, the red is from wind erosion, and you can see it decreased by 2007. So we've solved that problem, but we didn't think of it holistically because now we have a problem with water. And over the map to the right shows the water stress index, which increases up to 20% in a lot of these areas in the Great Plains. And this is only talking about surface water. This isn't even talking about groundwater. The map to the left is talking about groundwater, and it shows those really dark red spaces that basically show an entire depletion of those sections of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is depleting as much as 40 feet. And if they keep going this way, in the direction that they're going, we're actually thinking that there won't be an aquifer. So that's distressing. So, but there are solutions, and of course, these are solutions that are circulating around different circles, and one of them is called conservation agriculture, which is a new kind of movement of basically no-till agriculture, which basically secures the quality of the soil without any kind of disturbance of the different microbiome down there. There's really a huge subterranean community. For those of you not too much aware of soil science, basically underneath the soil is whole networks of fungus and bacteria and different worms, and this is a whole network that actually works together. You have the mycorrhizal fungus that are attaching to the roots of the plants and actually sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So this is not only turning into a strategy for habitat reclamation, but this is also, if this was done at a large enough scale, we could actually start to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So these kinds of, this kind of way of looking at it from the soil. And this is just an interesting quote that's very recent, coming from the UK. Countries can withstand coup d'etat, wars and conflict, leaving the EU, but no country can withstand the loss of its soil and fertility, because that is the basis of our entire survival, basically. But with all that said, with all that ecology stuff, again, it's a lot more than just climate change. It's a lot more than just the environment. One of the inspirations of this from Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey was this speech from Roosevelt, which basically outlined that among everyone we have these basic rights: a right to clean air, a right to clean water, and that shouldn't be up to question at all. And it should be all of our responsibility to make sure that we all have that security. And so they took this speech and were very inspired by that to create this new platform. So the Green New Deal goals, basically, as I sum it up here, breaking it down into 5 different categories: achieving net zero greenhouse gases, new jobs, investment in infrastructure, which makes me smile, ensured clean air, climate community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, all those basic rights. They're not privileges, they're rights. And then, of course, social, environmental, and economic justice, which is very looking at it on all communities at all scales. So then, just looking further at those goals, the government can take leadership. We have, some case studies here in the county. The county can get some credits if we maintain a certain level of maintenance of our water quality. Seattle, for example, has this thing called Green Factor, where buildings can actually get credits for installing green roofs and other sustainable practices. Then there's the private sector. And by the way, these are quoted directly from the legislation, so just so we can really get it. Basically working collaboratively with farmers and ranches and using better practices to remove the pollution and the greenhouse emissions. So some stuff like this is already happening. There's this article on The Guardian that talks about the conservation agriculture, and also just talks about regenerative agriculture in general, where it's not just enough to do the no-till, but we need to include wildlife areas and restore and afforest and all those things. And then another partner are conservation groups, which of course is very active here on the Cape. But those are a lot of opportunities. Any vacant properties owned by land trusts or towns those can be really good opportunities to restore pollinator habitat, for example. Or if it's near the coast, perhaps we can do some erosion mitigation, or there's a lot of different opportunities for that. And I guess I'll just leave off. I'll talk about this in a second, but basically, there are a lot of natural solutions. We can use nature as a partner in dealing with a lot of these issues, as we see more and more science about the way soil can sequester carbon, but also provide the habitat and the biodiversity that can basically solve the water quality and the air quality crisis as well. And I just wanted to add this, that actually there is a majority approval of the Green New Deal. So this is really great that people are coming together, because if there's approval and people are coming together, then we can actually solve these problems. So I went a little bit of overtime, but I'd be happy to answer questions at the end. And one last thing. These natural solutions are a good start, but they aren't the only solution. We need net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to update our other economic and infrastructural systems. So to that end, I would transition that over to Gordon. Are you next? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, take a slide that we want to do. Okay, I didn't bring any slides, sorry. My name is Gordon Starr. I'm a member of 350 Cape Cod. As if anybody, 350 is a national group started by Bill McKibben from Middlebury College. Some people shake their heads. You've heard that. 350. I can do a quiz. What's 350 stand for? Parts per million. This 350 parts per million is where we should have stopped in terms of putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. 150 years ago, it was 280 parts per million. We're now somewhere about 210. Unfortunately, we're somewhere about 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and it seems to be still going up every year. So I'm a member of 350. I'm also a member of the Town Committee in Barnstable, the Infrastructure and Energy Committee. So I'm here to talk about energy. So how that Ben started talking about agriculture. The Green New Deal is still a resolution. It's sort of a big umbrella. So part of what we're here for is to talk about to create details and things that we can do locally. A lot of it's going to have to rely on us locally, it seems these days, either on the state level, the county level, the town level, or in our individual homes. So the original Green New Deal wasn't. Somebody asked me the other day, so is it one big package? And the answer is no. Back in 1933, when it all started, the New Deal, it was a number of different programs, and actually you had a list of the years. So year after year they started new programs, and we're going to have to do the same thing. Some of them will work, some of them won't. We'll learn from some of them, and we'll move forward. but we really have to do it. So just to underscore the urgency, the IPCC report that said that we have about 12 years to lower our carbon fuel use by about 45%. That's a 40 in 12 years. I don't know. It's going to be a hard push, but we'll have to try. So I'm going to talk about the energy sectors a little bit. There are a couple of sectors would include industry, agriculture. They're not so connected, in terms of industry. And agriculture uses a lot of energy. So I'm going to talk about electricity generation, buildings, and transportation. So just those three real quick. So I'm going to sort of touch on the basic points of each one of those and some of the local efforts being made to improve things. So electricity generation. We still get most of our fuel, our electricity from gas, oil, and coal. And that's got to change. Vineyard wind is a great start, I think. And it's coming in, I live in Barnstable, and the wire so it's about 14 miles south of Martha's Vineyard. And it's the first one, but it's the first block of about 5 or 6 blocks that are down there that will be developed for wind. And then we had a fight with the Army about where the cable was going to come in. But that's just the first. That's the only cable that can come to the Cape. The rest of them will probably have to go to Bradenton Point, the coal plant that is down there in the Fall River. So we need to work toward no new fossil fuel infrastructure. So we're going to make this transition. We can't keep building natural gas pipelines. We can't keep building power plants like on the canal. They just finished a third power plant down there, a third burn. And we protested against that. And the Conservation Law Foundation helped us, but we couldn't stop it. But then I'm talking to this crowd that's out here that I live in Barnstable and I have natural gas. But you guys, how many people don't have natural gas? I think it goes to what, East Ham? A little bit of East Ham, yeah. So here I am advocating that you guys never get it. So maybe. So you throw me out now. But we have to think 40, 50 years ahead. If we start putting in gas pipelines, then they're going to be there 40 or 50 years, and we only have 10 or 15 years to transition away from gas. That's going to be difficult. So the more infrastructure you have, the harder it gets. So we need more wind and photovoltaic energy production. It's still only about 6 or 7%. So in Mount Desert Island up near Bar Harbor, they did a study of all the roofs on the island, and they figured that if they put, and you can do it with GPS now. So they look at every roof, and they said that if we put photovoltaics on every roof, we could get 85% of our electricity just from the sun. So that's something to think about. Vineyard wind is there. One of the problems we have with energy generation is that the solar, it basically produces power from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And most people use their electricity, most of it, from 5 o'clock to like 8 o'clock. So it's not really in sync with the sun. The wind will help. There's a new battery going into Provincetown that you've heard of. The Eversource is putting in a big, huge battery storage area, so battery near the dump up there. Just to cut down on the peak. I mean, you can charge it during the day, and then when people are using the most energy, it can kick in and lower that down. It can also work if power lines go out. So it helps with the resilience and just we need a smarter grid. Is what we need. We need grid. We need things to talk to each other, like batteries talking to photovoltaic cells. But it's going to happen slowly. But we'll see. So that the energy. Let's move on. So the other two sectors are buildings and transportation. And I think just as an umbrella, we have to think about using more electricity. We have to electrify almost everything. I think electricity is going to be our future power. I think a lot of us remember the days when electric houses were scary because the electric bills were so high. But the electricity now isn't isn't sort of resistance electricity, more of it's used in compressors, mini split heat pumps, and we're going to have to start thinking in that direction. So buildings worldwide use about 39% of the energy that we use. Most of us are going to have to start thinking about retrofit. Planning ahead a little bit. How long is your furnace going to last? What are you going to do when it goes? How long is your water heater going to last? What are you going to do? Those are pretty hard questions. I found it pretty hard to find information on some of those things, but we need to keep working at it. Looking at appliances, how are we going to cook? We're using electricity, stoves, those kind of things. We just need, I think, planning ahead is the thought there. The other thing with buildings are, so most of us are going to be retrofitting buildings, because there aren't that many new buildings. In Barcelona, we had 65 new buildings last year. But we need to consider, but at the same time, municipal towns are planning new buildings, and we have to think about those. I know in Provincetown there's a new police station. In Barcelona, we just built, in Hyannis, we built a new fire station, which actually has no solar panels on it at all, which is a shame. And I think we need to think about that. It's going to last 40 or 50 years. I think that's one place people can get really involved is in some of that municipal planning. I don't know what to say. Just in Cambridge, they built 3 schools that are net zero. So there are places that are using tighter building codes than we have. Provincetown, Truro, and Wellfleet are all green communities, along with some of Mashpee, Yarmouth. And so you've actually adopted stricter building codes than the base code in Massachusetts. I come from art school, we can't get any traction. I don't know what it is. So we're still working on that. So let's see, so buildings, we just need to keep working. Transportation, again, you have to think about electrifying transportation. We need to. There are certain places that are going to disallow. By the year 2030, you won't be able to buy a gasoline engine. Certain countries have already decided that. So we have to make the transition. It's tough now because they're so expensive. And the other piece of that is electric charging stations. And there's been more and more talk about electric charging stations, and there are programs from Eversource, the Mass Clean Energy Center, and there's actually some Volkswagen money from the settlement, the diesel settlement that's out there that provides some money for electric charging stations. And in Barnstable, we're building a new rec center in the village of Oscarville. And so my question is, are we planning ahead? What kind of energy system we're going to use? What's going to be powering it 40 years from now? Are there electric charging stations already built in? It's easier to do it while you're building the building. Are there water refill stations? That's one thing. I don't know if Town of Falmouth is way ahead of us on that. They used to actually, Town of Falmouth use CPC funds within water refilling stations. So that's it. Martha's Vineyard Regional Transit Authority is moving toward 100% electric buses. And let's see, the Cape Cod Fire is putting in a big new building. They're putting in 6 charging stations, but 6 charging stations for 300 employees seems a little, especially when you've got to be pouring cement today. Another neat example from around here is the Friends of Pleasant Bay have just bought a pontoon boat for educational purposes. It's, I don't know, like 34 feet long or something. It has 2 electric engines in it. So they're going to take 3rd and 4th graders and high school kids out into Pleasant Bay, and it's a scientific platform that they're going to use. Pretty interesting. Last I heard they were having trouble with the Coast Guard because they were electric engines. They're not going out to the ocean, but it's a neat idea, and I like that. So basically, we need to think about electrification. Join a local group, join a town committee, run for office. Keep track of some of the state laws that are coming through. There are a lot of them, and most of them won't get voted on until next fall. But coming up with Sarah Peak, Julian Sear, and just keep track of some of those. And just keep working at it, because we have to. If we don't, maybe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Montana Bailey, and I consider myself to be a youth environmental activist. And I'm here today to tell you about some of the local youth environmental activist programs that we have here, specifically at Nauset High School. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this relates to the New Deal and kind of how this legislation is relating to the younger generations. So I first started getting involved kind of in environmental activism when I was a freshman at Nauset, and I saw a presentation by an organization known as 5 Gyres, which is a nonprofit that does research regarding plastic pollution within our ocean gyres. And then I found out that there's a club where students had gathered to fight plastic pollution, specifically on campus. We were hand-building mugs within the ceramics program and selling them to students so they could take them to local coffee shops and fill them up instead of getting a styrofoam cup or a plastic cup. And this is when I truly got inspired and started educating myself more on different environmental issues regarding water quality and the pollution that we're suffering from. So yeah, YAPP focuses a lot of our time towards making these mugs and selling them. I have some today. They're $20, and 50% of the proceeds go towards the Center for Coastal Studies in order for them to continue their marine debris research. I'm also a member of the Green Club at Nauset, and we focus on numerous different local sustainability practices. Right now, we are currently doing a pop-up thrift shop where we take students' secondhand clothing and we sell it, and the proceeds from that go towards getting metal silverware in our cafeteria because we currently have plastic. Some other things that we've done this year is we are revamping our school garden, which turned into a glorified weed patch. And we also increased the different recycling facilities that we had at the school. We primarily had just trash cans in our classrooms and in our cafeteria. And the Green Club raised enough money to buy separated trash bins in order to not only have us recycle and compost within our school, we just got a new industrial composter, and we're using that compost in our garden, but also to educate kids on how to divide their waste. Because kids didn't know what recycling was. And you think, well, this is shocking, like I know what recycling is, but no one was teaching them. No, they had no resource to learn how to do this. And my co-president of the Green Club had a great quote when we were at the climate strike at the State House a few months ago. And it says, "Climate action starts with us, at our own level, changes we can make in our own routines that are more globally minded. It's not just an issue that's over our heads, but it's something that starts and ends with us." So as a younger individual, I have been met with a lot of different restrictions because of my age and the lack of education regarding environmental sustainability, just because I'm so young. But the thing is, I've grown up in this environment. I've grown up in an age where people were using single-use items, and at a young age, I grew used to it. I just assumed that I was supposed to throw everything away. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized this wasn't the case. And I found it to be my responsibility to make changes within my own daily life that preserve my environment, but also to promote my peers and my classmates to do the same, because we will be left with this earth. And there's a lot already wrong with it, and I didn't want to do anything to contribute to that. So I've not only made differences within my life, whether that's turning off the lights when I leave the house, or bringing my own mug when I go get coffee with my friends, or choosing to use a metal straw instead of a plastic straw. You may see these things as small and trivial. However, if we all do them, it will have such a massive impact. And we can change legislation. The legislation just needs to be changed. We can make these changes, but it all starts with the culture. The culture needs to change. People need to be putting these practices into action. And I think that starts with kids my age. We need to be teaching young kids at an early age how to recycle and what is climate change, so that when they grow up, they're able to put these practices into action. Little things they can do within your daily life Amazon sells these mesh bags that you can bring to the supermarket instead of getting your own little plastic bag every single time you buy a bunch of bananas. They're, I want to say $2 for a few bags, and they have the ounceage on them, so you can actually subtract the cost of the weight of the bag. You can buy a mug and bring it to your local coffee shop. Some coffee shops even give discounts for bringing your own mug, so you're technically saving money. Going to stores that you can buy things in bulk instead of buying small pre-packaged things every single time you need your oats or you need your baking powder. Buy it in bulk. Use a metal straw. That is one of my biggest things. Is I go to Nauset and I see all these kids who are going to hole-in-one and getting their iced coffees with their plastic straws every morning when they can just buy a metal straw and use that for the rest of their life. So I'm really big on not only doing these things within my life, but educating my peers, because a lot of them don't know how to recycle and what to do. They're passionate about the environment, but they don't know how to get involved. So I promote getting involved with our clubs, educating them on specific topics that they are passionate about, whether it be air quality or water quality. We live on Cape Cod, where the landscape is constantly changing. I grew up at Nauset Beach with Liam's, and I'd go get my onion rings. Liam's is now in the ocean, and they have been trying to rebuild the dunes. There's evidence of this throughout my entire life, and only now are kids starting to get involved. I recently partook in the climate strike at the State House, as I mentioned earlier, and it was so inspiring to see all these kids there. It was all kids, us all rallied, voicing our opinions, and I think this needs to be spread. I think the word needs to spread. These kids are going to have to be left with this world that is already crumbling. We don't want it to completely fall apart. So, yeah, I think with the New Deal, I think this is one of the first passage of legislation that we need that really involves the kids. I hear kids talking about it in the hallway, and we don't really see that a lot in politics. So I think that in order for it to progress, it needs to involve people like me. And yeah, so I have all my contact information if you want to come contact me about anything. The Nauset Green Club, the Youth Against Plastic Pollution Club, and those are the sites for the two nonprofits I was talking about. The Center for Coastal Studies, which is based out of, I want to say, Provincetown, and the Five Gyres, which is an international organization. Thank you.
Well, as the slides are coming up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Madhavi Venkatesan. I'm an economist, and I'm going to speak to you specifically from an economic perspective because the Green New Deal is related to economy, and I think there's some aspects of it that we haven't really talked about, and one of them specifically is the social construction of our reality. And I think it's really sort of an important topic that we should discuss, understand where our culture is coming from, and why really it's not about the word of the New Deal, but the intention of the New Deal that needs to be conveyed properly, and that's a value proposition. Value propositions can only be conveyed, in my opinion, from a grassroots level. So the Green New Deal, when you actually read the document itself, if you look at the House resolution, you'll notice very clearly that it states regularly aspects of local government. And there's a reason for that. So if you don't mind, some of my slides are going to be a little repetitive because when you talk about something that's related to climate change, obviously some of the slides will all have in common, will be related to climate change. But let me just tell you a little bit about myself first, so that way you can see the normative component or the subjective analysis that I'm providing to you. I am the executive director of a nonprofit here on the Cape. It's called Sustainable Practices. Some of you may be familiar with us. We initiated the Cape, or the municipal plastic bottle ban, which is part of our umbrella, the Cape plastic bottle ban. We have filed in 9 towns. We were fortunate that in Wellfleet, the Wellfleet Recycling Committee assisted us, based on Beth and Lydia, of course, and they did pass a portion of our ban. We are working with other towns, and we'll completely finish the Cape at soon by the end of the year. I have 2 people in the audience that I'd like to point out. There's Carla Capel over here, who is part of our Barnstable, and the head of our Barnstable is our liaisons, and then Erin Hilly over there, who is part of our Brewster group. So we are growing. We are, I think, very solidified in our movement, but we are fundamentally a grassroots movement. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a Green New Deal from the same standpoint of the value proposition of grassroots. So as an economist, I teach at Northeastern presently, but as an economist, I also believe that fundamentally the biggest issue that we have as a country is a lack of economic literacy. We are born economic agents and we die economic agents, and all through our lives we act as economic agents. To the extent that we don't understand the responsibility of being an economic agent, or only see economics from a supply and demand of functionality without taking into consideration externalized costs in our decision making, we contribute to the problems we see around us. So if I were to poll every single one of you, you'd probably tell me they're environmental justice and social justice practitioners of some sort, because obviously we always end up speaking to the same like-minded audiences. But if you were to analyze the types of purchasing behavior that you have, even though you believe that you are environmentally just focused or socially just focused, you'd find that through your supply chain you're probably very much living in some level of hypocrisy, because the market has presented a veil to you that's allowed you very easily to continue to do that. So fundamentally, what the issues that we see today, in my opinion, are really related to our lack of individual responsibility, our carelessness with regard to how we divest ourselves of that responsibility, coming from a social construction element of intergenerational divestment. So our parents didn't go to town meeting, we don't go to town meeting. Our parents didn't actively participate or volunteer, we stopped doing that too. We have become a society that, and I have a slide up here if I can get to it. I know I'm going to talk probably longer than I'll be able to go through all my slides. But I have a slide that reminds us of our history. Look back at Jimmy Carter. I show this quite often. 1979, Culture of Malays speech, State of the Union address. He told us at that time, he said, we become a nation of consumers. Our primary focus is how much we have, how much we accumulate. We have lost touch with the things that really matter to us, which is our families, our friends. He said to us at that time, which I think is also a fundamental issue and flaw if we don't really grasp it right now, that we shouldn't be so dependent upon energy. That was in the 1880s, right? We were finishing up our energy crisis then. All that we have done in the last 40 years is increase our dependence on energy. So what I want to say with regard to that, and I'm just giving you my foundational points right now, is it doesn't matter whether we move to renewable energy, because if we still have the same idea that because it's cheap, because the pricing mechanism is inefficient and it tells us it's cheap when it's really not, because there's always an externalized impact, right? We will continue to use more. So where we have alleviated a footprint on one hand, we will create a new footprint on another. It's called the green paradox, because it means that as we are alleviating the greenhouse gases that we call as issue today, we actually start to create other kind of ecosystem damage, because our actual fundamental problem is in our use, our lack of disconnect to the concept of convenience. Neoclassical economics, what we practice today in this country, what we export, when we talk about GDP growth as being the primary barometer of economic strength, tells us to externalize costs and not think about the impacts, the adverse impacts, to only think about supply and demand. And I'm going to just point out one thing that really bothers me when we talk about prices. Prices are the ultimate indication of exploitation. Because what a price tells you is that who is stronger, the supplier or the consumer? Because that's how the price ends up being what it is. We don't live in an equitable system where both parties are equally powerful. So prices inherently cannot be efficient. Nor do we live in a system where people reach beyond their bounded rationality to make risk profiles for what they don't know. And what I mean by that is each one of us has a knowledge set based on their education. But that's our bounded rationality, right? Only when we go out of that bounded range do we see what we don't know. We can then buffer the risk of what we don't know into our decision making. So the Green New Deal can be very successful, but the primary focal point to make the Green New Deal successful is a translation of the intention into a value structure change within this economy. Because what the Green New Deal is calling for is for people to have equal access to income, to have economic equity. Poverty is not an issue of our millennia. Poverty has been around forever. Why has it been around forever? Because it's only on the back of poverty that wealth is created. Poor people cannot afford to make choices. They have to take the prices that are given to them. Poor people cannot negotiate for their labor costs. They have to take whatever wage is provided them. So they're the ultimate exploited agent. We can't exploit them in the US because we have regulatory mechanisms unless we have the illegal population. So we have exploited externally to the US. The reason why emissions are higher in third world countries or developing nations is not because they're so much focused on catching up, but because we've externalized our production costs and externalized our production elsewhere. Our lower emissions domestically are only because we've increased them through the countries that we import from. So with that, I'm going to give you a little repetition because I've talked enough that perhaps maybe you don't remember some of these slides. So if you won't mind bearing with me, I have a slightly different spin on these because I talk about sustainability all the time. So these are the primary elements that cause our greenhouse gas emissions. Many of them you're already familiar with. 65% of our fuel generation in terms of electric power generation comes out of fossil fuels. So that's number one reason why our current president, who was on a GDP-based platform for his election, does not want to move off of fossil fuels because we don't have an infrastructure that can actually compete. We don't have a way of transferring the energy generation. I'll explain what that means in 1 second. So, carbon, can I take the other way? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, turn it on. These slides, I think, are really, really important, okay? So, all of you pretty much have heard of the gross domestic product, right? We measure it, not everybody necessarily studies it, but the gross domestic product was created in the 1930s as a mechanism of being able to gauge US domestic growth or production. It became a global indicator in the 1940s. So, obviously, if it wasn't here, we have calculated this by using historical data. But the part that I want you to focus on is the slope of this line. Okay? So this is GDP growth in the US, of course, because we target our entire economy against GDP. This is cumulative CO2 emissions. Our GDP growth came at the cost of energy production because you can't grow an economy without energy. You have to have it to do the very, very seedbed of the factory, right? You have to have it for production purposes. So on a cumulative level, excuse me, this doesn't have the date on it, it's 1850 to 2011. It's 1850 to 2011. The US is responsible for 27% of cumulative CO2 emissions in the global atmosphere. The next largest is right here at 25%. That's the EU combined. So there's a very strong misconception that somehow these developing countries are creating so much emission. The bottom line is we have to look at it from a cumulative basis, not from a 1-year basis or a 2-year basis, because there are other factors that are also contributing to that increase, as I noted too. It's importation of goods from these countries, right? This is a slide you may be familiar with. I've been trying to find an updated version of this for a while. As Gordon pointed out, we are far in excess of 400 parts per million, but this is the coring, the ice coring, gives us a data period for 400,000 years. We know that in the recent period, we've had an increase. The reason why this is important is it's the 70 years that the IPCC saw specifically as being attributable to human behavior for why greenhouse gas emissions have increased, but I'm trying to show you and paint you the story that it's also a US story. Oops. And this is why it's a US story. The US story is because GDP is comprised of these 4 components. Anybody know how much consumption plays a role in GDP in the US? Just a general ballpark. I'm sure one of you will have a very good number that's pretty close. 50%?
At least.
60%? So it's anywhere between 65 to 70% on an average basis. So the reason why this is important is it tells you that fundamentally we, as individual consumers, as people who want high returns on our investments, as people who don't hire appropriate government officials in to regulate properly for us, we are responsible for this. Okay, so consumption, these are just some simple pictures. So this is deforestation in Burma, this is plastic in Manila Bay, this is any kind of strip mine you want to find anywhere. I mean, this is coal. But consumption is really, it's really a value, right? We're taught this. We're taught that we have insatiable appetites to consume. I would argue we don't. We're taught that, and then we're enabled in this economy to think that way too. I'm an immigrant, so I was born in India, and I came to this country. But I remember when I was growing up, when I was a little girl, my mother used to always use the paper really well. And she always made me write on paper on one side. We never just threw things away. But I always wanted to be like my American peers, who just seemed to always have everything pristine and clean and neat and throw away, and I didn't appreciate that. I do today. It takes a while, but this country has a way of making you feel inferior when you don't have throwaway mentality. So, awareness, fundamentally, is what I would say is what we need to think about in terms of actually a Green New Deal or changing our values. We have to actually start to critically assess why we believe what we believe, where those values came from. I believe a lot of it has to do with how this country was settled, and there's a little intertwining of religion, but I don't have time to talk to you specifically about that. I teach a class called Religious Influences on Economics. And it's very interesting to see how religion has played such a powerful role in terms of legitimizing one group's ability to take from another group. So there's a very strong moral component to all of this, but that morality isn't necessarily one that's focused on anything other than hypocrisy. But economics in itself, the true basis of economics, Adam Smith, the invisible hand, all of that came out of a sense of moral justice. Adam Smith believed in benevolence. The invisible hand is the hand of the deity, hand of God coming in and interacting within a market mechanism so that fundamentally what a person would do out of pure self-interest would not happen. So this is just a couple slides just showing you where we are and how we have moved over this very short period of time and the global Earth surface temperatures. So all these are directly related to our GDP focus, in my opinion. Okay? Because power has generated, this need for power has generated more use of fossil fuels because it was the cheapest and most accessible. And these are all the negatives that have come out as a result. And these are just pictures, so I'm just going to go through the pictures just to show you, and then we're going to just go over a summary slide quickly. So a couple of things that you would have seen right now is the storm activity. You see medical issues, fire, food prices, climate refugees will be another one, but it's not going to be on a slide here. Water scarcity is a big issue coming up, period. Most people don't understand or have not bothered to think about the supply chain of the foods they even eat. It's twice as much water footprint than the water in the bottle, right? For a water bottle, pound of hamburger, 650 gallons of water. So we use a lot more resource, and we use that in this country specifically because the supply and demand mechanism doesn't give symmetry of information. We're buying cheap, and we value based on how much we spend. So think about this as a very different way of thinking of it, though. We take life to have life. We take life to have life. But we can't understand the intrinsic aspect of another life. And we allow the market mechanism to determine its worth. So that means we can throw away food, we throw away animal meat, because we paid so little for it. And this is actually embedded in so many aspects of our culture, and so many aspects of how we behave, because we have no longer been able to determine intrinsic value, we only allow the market to determine a person's value too. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly and then give you a summary component. But here's the cost of carbon. So this is the ultimate cost of the power generation we've had. That 27% that has made the U.S. so dominant in terms of our standard of living has caused all of these things on a global basis. So when we think about the Paris Agreement, we think about specifically how much the U.S. has absorbed in this personal responsibility. I say personal meaning if we're going to take countries as individual entities. We've taken very little responsibility for it. And that's a very sad thing is we have to pay for it at a time when our own country is actually at an economic decline. So it's number one threat to the global economy. But I believe you have to look deeper, and this is my belief right here. You cannot use the same neoclassical model to create the change that's needed today. We have to have a cultural shift We have to have a different perspective on what we think and what we value. So I already mentioned Jimmy, who I had an opportunity to meet one day. He was on a plane with me, and he walked down the entire aisle. It was one of the most wonderful days of my life to meet that man. But this is, I just point out a couple other things, and then I'll give you a couple comments real quickly. So sustainability, there is no standardized definition for sustainability. That's why the Green New Deal doesn't really actually just address it and dances around it. The only definition we have, the one that most commonly is used, is in our Common Future report that came out in 1987, the Brundtland Commission, which basically said that we want to make sure that future generations have the same ability to consume as present generations, right? Now, economics, it's amazing. This is what I find so amazing about this. This is why I want to bring these topics up to you, and hopefully we can solidify the comments that I was hoping to make. Is all these years, when we talked about the environment and we talked about economics, we talked about them separately. And yet, if you ask any economist, or you'll ask anybody what is the definition of economics, they'll always tell you it's about resource utilization, right? It has something to do with resource. Well, we kept these separate for a very long time, until 87, until the Brundtland Commission. When the Brundtland Commission finally said you cannot talk about the environment and economics separately anymore. So I have to use my hands here. Neoclassical economics, what you practice in the world around us, tells you that the environment is a subset of the human system. We control it, we can do what we want to with it, we can fix it. What ecological economics or heterodox economists such as myself would tell you is that the economy, human economy, is a subset of the environmental system. Without it, we can't survive. I don't think Jeff Bezos thinks that's why he's sending people out to the moon. But, that's another problem that we have to contend with. But the big issue is that we are a subset of this environment, and we don't understand it. We have not taken the time to, and it's a cultural manifestation of those people who actually invaded America many years ago. They didn't come here looking for a new home, they came here looking to get rich. When you go someplace and you think it's going to be your home, you take care of it, and that stewardship responsibility you transfer intergenerationally. When you think of something as a resource for you to use to get rich off of, you transfer that intergenerationally. I think that has a lot to do with the type of economy that we today support. It's not that capitalism necessarily in a neoclassical setting has to be bad. It's that our values implemented in the system are flawed. They come without any responsibility. We have freedom with no responsibility. So, oops, I'm going backwards. Sorry. I don't think I'm going backwards. I think I have the same slide, so forgive me for that one. This is obviously the Paris Agreement. I was in Paris for this. That's another story for another time, literally. But these are 4 elements I'm going to go over with regard to the Green New Deal. Green New Deal, basically, in my opinion, requires us to think from a sustainability-based social mission statement. We do not have a social mission statement in this country. Some people would argue that our Constitution is our social mission statement, but a social mission statement would be then one umbrella that sort of guides all of our policies. We all have to tie those policies to it. Corporations have mission statements. Everything about the corporation has to tie back into that mission statement. With a society devoid of a mission statement, that means that all you're looking at is iterative changes in values. You're not necessarily looking at an anchoring of values. The Green New Deal promotes strong local economies, which means there would be no Stop and Shops. Target wouldn't be moving into Cape Cod Mall. We'd be looking at our next door neighbor to help us satisfy our needs. Because it wouldn't matter about having a whole closet full of clothing. It would just matter having the clothing that we need to use. So there's a big difference. It's the internalization of externalized costs, because you'll see in the Green New Deal, just the platform itself, it discusses social and environmental justice issues, which means specifically some aspects of what I discussed before, the exploitation of labor, exploitation of the environment because it has no voice, it's vulnerable, and you can take advantage of it because there's no regulation to protect it. The Green New Deal specifically addresses the idea that you would now take into consideration holistic impacts. So just for a simple example, since I'm working on the municipal plastic bottle ban, if you look at plastic bottles, they come out of a fossil fuel base. Fossil fuels are supposedly something we're trying to get rid of our dependence upon. So there's a negative right there. Then you have the emissions associated with that, which are carcinogenic and have adverse impacts to people living within the localities where those plastics are typically created. Then you have the consumption issue, which lasts a very short amount of time, yet based on leaching can adversely impact the human body. Then you have the waste issue, which one could argue is indefinite, right? Well, the externalization of costs would mean that a plastic water bottle filled with water, Poland Spring bottle, should cost you maybe $7 or $8, which would then reduce the amount of consumption, right? So that would be, if we actually internalize the externalized costs, we would have higher prices. This is the other thing. We don't have any cradle-to-cradle production in this country. We have what we call waste diversion, so things that could have been put in the garbage because they have no real life, no recycle value life. We sometimes divert the waste by creating a new product of it. That doesn't mean that at some point in time it won't end up being waste. A zero waste economy would mean literally that when something goes to waste, it will become an input in another process, or it can just be regenerated and reused. In order to grow our GDP-based economy, you need to have planned obsolescence, or at least fashion-based obsolescence on a routine basis, to cause people to feel like they have to buy something new. In this type of system, you would not be judging your value based on having the newest item, but perhaps maybe valuing yourself based on the thrift that you show. And then the last portions of the Green New Deal are specific to social equity and stability. So this is related to employment. And this is where I think fundamentally the true value change or true value proposition exists. Because you often hear, we see this especially when we talk about people who live in poverty or live in marginalized communities, that somehow they deserve to live there, why should we have to do more for them, and so on and so on. So the idea of equity is a very hard sell for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. This is where we fail as social activists on many levels. We have to think about the different alignment issues. So for some person, maybe the alignment issue isn't so much garnering their empathy towards an individual, but thinking from the standpoint, how can we let them know that their health will be bettered, or the political stability will be greater by having a greater amount of social equity. Maybe they can also gain some knowledge by understanding the human history that we have in this country that is institutionalized inequity. And it's very, very important. So there are many opportunities here, whether it be an individualized channel, a selfish-oriented channel, an empathy-generated channel. We have to be like the marketers that we have succumbed to all these years in our marketing of the type of social change we're looking for. These are the last two things. I just have a book that's coming out. It's related to sustainable development goal, which is just decent work and economic growth. And I'm not plugging it because I don't know if it will be necessarily something desirable for the mass audience. But I'm just telling you this because there is one aspect that I think is really interesting. I want to leave you with this comment. And that's specific to women. How many of you hear about women making 70 cents of the man's dollar? Do you believe that's true? That's not true. What it really, this is an area where, again, our neoclassical economic system causes us problems. On an average, it's true. If I took all the average of wages, yes, 70 cents on the man dollar that we weighted by men. But when we talk about it from that perspective, we are skewing the ability to actually create good policy. Because that 70 cents is skewing the fact that you might have a multimodal distribution. In other words, you might have pockets of people at different income levels because of variation in occupation. What you're not getting at is the very fact that maybe that average at 70 cents is really related to the occupational segregation of women in lower occupations. So how can you fix that problem if you just say it's a pure wage discrimination issue? You can only fix that problem if you try to figure out where that occupational segregation is occurring and why. And one other thing I just want to give as a takeaway here, because I'm really passionate about this particular issue, especially because it has a lot to do with people in the global south, is that the whole concept of unpaid work and we look, because unpaid work is important in the Green New Deal too. Because we have become a country that only values people based on the income they make, women are unfortunately marginalized for that reason. There's only 24 hours in a day for a woman, just the same as it is for a man. So if a woman does have unpaid work for social reasons and has to, or feels obliged to take care of certain things because maybe she only can in her household, the penalty is not so much with the labor market as it is with our society. Are children a familial or community asset? See, this is where we're fundamentally flawed in our country. Children are a community asset. They're not familial. They cost us all. And they all add to the society at large. So if we actually looked at children as a community asset, then we would understand why we have to validate women's work. We understand because it's not just work in the household, it's work for the community at large, right? So these are a couple of ways of thinking. So would you all mind doing one thing for me? Put your hand out like this. Put your fingers together like this, just for a second. Humor me. Okay. Now I want you to poke your head through that hole. You think it can't be done? What I'm trying to say is that the time has come to not just look at the words the way we've been looking at them, but think outside the box as to what those words really mean and signify in terms of a value change, a value proposition. If we keep on thinking the same way and just expect a different outcome because we're now supporting different industries, we're going to end up with the same calamities. We will not fix our problems. The strongest thing that we have going for us, especially on the Cape, forgive me, the sustainable practices, but because we are the epitome, in terms of my opinion, of what fundamentally a grassroots movement should be about. Doesn't mean that that's the only grassroots movement out there, but it's one that I'm familiar with. We have these people from different places, different ages, working together on a common cause because we all feel passionate about it. But we also know fundamentally we're doing the right thing. So does it mean that everybody buys into what we talk to them? No. But it does mean that we keep pushing forward. And we don't have to worry about everybody buying into it. See, consensus, I don't believe in consensus. Consensus means the lowest common denominator wins, in my opinion. Because if you give voice to everyone, sometimes you're giving voice to people who may not understand where we need to go. And that may not sound right in a democracy, but fundamentally a democracy only works when everybody's also educated on the issue. We give away the freedom of democracy without any expectation of education on the issues. So perhaps that's where the grassroots movement are the strongest, is to start to think about those holes where people need to be educated and not blaming them for not knowing, but constructively educating them in a way that they can come and have a seat at the table, at least exercise even their different opinion, but with proper knowledge of what they're arguing for, rather than some sort of emotionalized state. And I've talked a lot, and I've come very close to the end, so I'm just going to go. And I appreciate your humoring me, but this is my last slide, and I really like this particular slide. I like the quote. So I have many of these different types of quotes. My one quote is, "Human convenience is an expense the environment cannot afford." But I also think that we are all mortal. And we're born knowing that we're going to die. So I don't understand why we wouldn't think that way every day and make our lives meaningful by doing something that creates a positive change, especially when we need so many of those positive changes. So thank you so much.
So much, Madhavi, Gordon, Montana, and Ben, for your presentations, just from the bottom of my heart. We're going to break for just a 5-minute intermission for people who might need to get up, stretch their legs, use the facilities or just leave because they have something to do the next day. So for people who are interested in participating in a conversation, you may have questions for our panelists. You're welcome to stay, and we'll go from there. And I should add that we're only going to go until 9 o'clock, so you won't be here forever if you do decide to stay. So, all right, I'll see you back in 5 minutes. So it's 8:36, but yeah, so we're opening it up. I'm going to ask that people leave their commentary to below 2 minutes, just so we can get as many maximum viewpoints as possible in the room. All right, so does anybody have a question or comment that they would like to share? Yes, in the orange shirt.
Oh, I was just thinking, talking
You
about how,
if you can stand up, yeah.
just talking with a few friends here about how we should start consuming less, encourage and carry around a coffee cup. And I was just thinking about, in the 70s, we used to have consciousness raising groups. And how do we start helping each other stop consuming and spread information about the New Deal? And maybe we just need these consciousness raising groups for the little kids.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things about the public library is, this is such a great space for conversation, but also that we have to keep having these conversations until there are solutions to the problem. And I hear a lot of talking to the choir or preaching to the choir, and does this get redundant? And I would argue no, because we can't assume what other people know, and that we have to create a culture that obviously it's a paradigm shift, but also just until the solutions are met, we just have to keep doing this. So I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. All right, more comments, yes.
I'd like to address a comment to Montana. Montana, you said several times that you need to talk to young people to get them to understand other young people. I want you to know you need to talk to elders also. We really get it when you say the things that you're saying. It's really effective. I recently gave a presentation to a bunch of men, older men, and I showed a video clip of Greta Thunberg speaking at one of the United Nations meetings where she spoke. 3 men cried as a result. They hadn't seen it, and 3 men cried. Young people really can affect how culture changes. Not just youth culture, but all our culture. So keep doing what you do. I really admire your energy.
Yes, over here.
I would echo the exact same sentiment to you, Montana. Thank you for coming. I was one of those men that cried, maybe not in your case. But you watched her break down in front of the EU a couple weeks ago and realize the burden this 15, 16-year-old girl was taking on. I'm going to do it now. It's really inspiring. So I think you kids, we went to a Sunrise group, Green New Deal, a couple weeks ago in Boston that was really inspiring. Marky and all were there, and it was mainly the Sunrise movement who have been so active. So 3 cheers to you, kids.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to address this to Madhavi. Just one of the statistics in your slide presentation that I was sort of surprised about was about the unemployment, 100% employment, because I keep hearing about automation and artificial intelligence and things like that, putting everybody out of work in a short time. I'm wondering, from an economic point of view, what your thoughts are about that.
Well, that's one of the key elements of the Green New Deal, that everyone would have a job. And every job, the most minimal aspect of a job would be that it would at least pay a fair living wage. The issue, I can address it based on the way that they are stating it. There are fundamental issues I have with that. I think I've already brought up a couple of them. And I remember the Green New Deal was just a platform that has yet to work itself out, but it's a more general, it's more of a vision, I would say, than it is an actual articulated methodology of how to achieve it. But the goal would be that everybody had a job, because what do we feel when we're working? We feel like we have value in a society, we have a place in a society, we have social interaction in a society. And that's really important for social cohesiveness. How those people would have a job could only occur because we would have to have
a little more redundancy than we currently do. In other words, AI would not be able to necessarily, capital would not be able to take labor. We would have to have more labor-intensive workforces in terms of any type of production process. It would require these small localized economies, because that's where you have that redundancy, rather than having a centralized production function that then causes a decrease in labor costs for the simple reason that it's centralized. You would have it duplicated in many little local areas. We have to talk specifically about individual types of industries in order to be able to discuss what this would look like. The reason why I hesitate so much is there's also an issue, an underlying issue of population, right? First of all, I believe, I don't care if we're only 300 or 400 million people, I'm going towards 400 million people in this country. We still are very, very densely populated. So population is an issue. And there's another issue that comes with population when you allow people to have fair living wages, is that, and if you don't educate them about the reason we should have more population controls, that population will continue to grow, right? So that's why I also brought up the example of the familial structure where the child is a communal asset or an individual asset, a familial asset. Because it's about how we think about the people around us. So it's a very complicated question that you're asking. I would imagine in this kind of system, because the localization of the decentralization would actually create greater opportunity for labor is one. But at the same time, sustainability is not going to generate high incomes. So either people are going to live with more modest incomes, and they're going to have to get their satisfaction out of the fact that their neighbors are not hungry. So that goes, that's forgive me, I don't want to keep going on, but I'm just going to say one last thing. That goes back to the social construction element that I brought up first. We label things, we label people as homeless, right? So we have distanced ourselves from responsibility for them because they're homeless, right? That they're a different type of entity. We talk about roadkill as now that was never an animate animal that somebody drove over. We have to start rethinking how we think about people and things in order to make that kind of system work. So there's so many other elements than just employment. Because if you employ all these people, and they all make living wages, everybody's going to get pregnant and keep having more babies. Right? More Pampers, more garbage, more all these other things. The education is to start first and then be synergistic with the other. Thank you. Yes.
Anyone comment on what countries we might emulate? I mean, which ones are doing better on this than we are? I lived in Germany back up until '87, and a lot of things they were doing even back then were better than what we're doing now. I mean, we were using cloth bags at the supermarket, and we could wash the cloth bags so that, you could use the same one for years. And here we're doing reusable plastic bags. Like you buy them at Stop and Shop and they're still plastic. And it's just like, what, and Hannaford's, which is a supermarket that you find up in North Countries, whatever, they had cloth bags. I'm still using the same ones for like 7 years or something. But I can wash it when something spills in it. So are there any other countries that are doing better on all of this stuff?
Countries with small populations and have homogeneous values typically fare better in terms of their environmental platform. The U.S. has heterogeneous systems in terms of people's value structures. We have this tendency to think of the other, and as long as you think of other people as being other, there's an element of exploitation that's embedded in it. And then we also have different senses of values with regard to how we look at the environment. People fundamentally believe they have a right to carry plastic. That's one of the biggest pushbacks we get. So it goes back to societal education. If you talk about what are the American values, there have been no indoctrinated American values in the public school system. These countries actually have national values. They have things that they generally believe in as a social mission statement, which is fundamentally lacking in our system. You cannot call American people to action because there's nothing that there's no tie that binds us.
Yep, in the back.
Me? One of the things I think about with all this, with the situation that we're in, is our astounding national productivity. And we've got our big machines, and just in my work life, the machines that I have really do increase what I can produce. And of course, if you're in a building, and then the people who own the machines, of course, tend to accrue the wealth that the machines generate unto themselves. So I was wondering, in terms of the New Deal, is there any thinking going on about how we're going to relate to the question of how productive we are and whether we're going to look at the quality of work? Like, is there any idea that we might go back to hand building things? So that's my question.
Yeah, I can actually just refer to the example of the conservation agriculture that I mentioned. I didn't mention this before, but when they actually transitioned to the no-till agriculture, they actually ended up having higher yields and a lot less costs because they were actually basically changing out all that use of machinery and all those different equipments that actually made their productivity like in just a simple, simple supply and demand framework that Madhavi was talking about. But when they actually restored the soil and actually created this kind of perennial habitat that was creating more of a yield. So there is actually an economic benefit in that case. So I think there are a lot of examples, at least with agriculture, that we can transition to. I think it goes back to just needing the education and just showing that it can be done in the first place, and just providing the resources that they need over there. Because I think there is a lot of opportunity to transition away from the traditional methods of, at least for farming. So there's a lot of other sectors in that, but just an example.
May I add one comment to that? And I'm so sorry I'm so long-winded in all my comments, but I am a professor and I guess I'm education gap in terms. I think it's value proposition change. If you grow up in a system where the values are that you make a lot for whatever you end up creating, then your expectation is that you should somehow reap the rewards of your productivity. If you live in a system like the Calvinist system, that's what is the basis of our economic system on many levels, where my great bounty is divine providence telling me that I am going to heaven, not going to hell, but it's not necessarily my right to keep it. My religion also tells me that I should share what I have with everyone. It's a different value structure. But society comes out of that value structure. We've just forgotten it over time. We can get it back. It's about reteaching people what's important based on what would keep our society sustainable long term. It only takes one generation. It takes probably less than that if you don't have written word, then people are illiterate. But we have, unfortunately, illiterate people in this country. If they can read, this is really always practiced with harmony in terms of living. But it's really about a value proposition. Without that, in my opinion, all the rest of it is going to fail.
But how do we get unified around that value system? I'm a public school teacher, so I think about my message, but it's not the same as other teachers. In every classroom that a student goes into, there's a value system and it changes. And that's part of the beauty of what living in a homogeneous society is in some ways. Then
as long as you have a social mission that's consistent with the welfare of everyone being represented in it, it's fine to have heterogeneous systems because it always ties back to that. The problem is when you don't have a guiding mission. Our guiding mission is on the Constitution, which is subject to interpretation based on law, right?
Right, yeah.
If we had one that was much more basic, that told us what we felt fundamentally what it defined to be an American, how we define our societies and what we thought of how we should be interacting, I think it would become easier, not only for the heterogeneity to coexist, but also the idea that the symmetry of values would be part of that too. Even though you could have heterogeneous mechanisms of achieving those values or those missions, societal missions, you would still be achieving the same thing.
Yeah, but where is that?
So you need leadership for that. That part
comes from the third element of being a rational economic agent, which is that you are a member of the government, and you actually facilitate having good people in office. We live in a so-called democracy, but we elect by minority, because we have less than the majority of people typically even involved in any election. And even if you did have a slight majority, it is the minority of that population that determines who the president is in most national offices. And in local situations, town government is even more pathetic. You have a town of 10,000 people, 500 people make the decision for the entirety of that town. So to the extent that we do not take on that third component of being an economic agent, and we allow the hiring into office of people who we don't even know their values and whether they conform to the needs of that particular job description, we're making great assumptions with regard to somebody else's desire to help on a communal level. You need benevolence in office, right? To make up for the lack of benevolence between us. So if you don't have community-minded people there, where is it going to come from?
Yeah,
I think this is like a two-pronged question, and it kind of builds off of what Ben was saying a while ago. I was reading, there's a study coming out from one of the major scientific journals. I can never remember names of anything, so I can't cite where it's coming from. But scientists did a study to say that basically planting 1 trillion trees over the next few decades would suck up a lot of the carbon and alleviate a lot of those problems. Countries like China and India and a bunch of the countries that surround the Sahara Desert all have these different programs, government funded, that are going in and just planting an inordinate amount of trees, like millions of trees, and it's awesome. The first part of my question is, do we have anything like that going on in the United States right now? And the other part of the question goes to, on the seed package, there's a quote from Hope Jarrett, who's a scientist, and she also wrote the book Lab Girl. In Lab Girl, she says, the one thing she wants everyone to take away from her book is plant one tree. Save some money to make sure that if the tree ever gets sick, you can help heal it. And it basically gets at the idea of all of us are able to do like these small actions of plant a tree, plant 2 trees, skip the straw, use reusable bags, buy loose produce. And those all seem like very, very simple things to do in your life. How do we get that out to the public in an appealing way to get a lot of people involved? So what's our country doing what is our country doing for planting trees? And how do you get these simple messages out on a broad scale?
I can take the second part. So especially with people my age, social media has become such a phenomenal tool in getting the word out, specifically promoting environmental consciousness. It's almost become trendy nowadays to be sustainable. There's different organizations that are making large amounts of money and doing things like, I don't know if any of you have heard of 4Ocean, but they're a brand that sells bracelets, and for every bracelet sold, they pick up a pound of trash. And I think by kind of what Madhavi was saying with the consumerism, changing the values and saying, well, yes, you're buying this product because you see others buying it around you, but connected to this is another concept. By doing that, it's almost a promotion of consumerism, but in a positive way. And I think that's really beneficial, and by getting it out there through things such as social media, and also the idea of seeing others with that is really beneficial. I mean, I personally, I know this sounds terrible, but I don't guilt my friends, but by myself doing it in front of them, they feel guilty. So then that motivates them to follow me. I think that's really powerful, and I'm not saying it's good to make people feel guilty, but it is a powerful tool that when used correctly can be very motivational.
Yeah, I would just say that coming from the perspective of environmental planning, one of the biggest challenges facing those kinds of vast, they call it afforestation, when you're trying to reclaim a completely destroyed piece of land, and which is different than reforestation, which is reforesting a destroyed land or a destroyed forest. One of the biggest difficulties with the way things are in the United States is the property ownership, because you have like 80 in any given town. You have like 80 to 90% of the land is owned by private residential home ownership, and so and in a lot of cases, particularly in the urban areas, it's a lot of really small, tight postage stamp parcels, and so it's really a matter of like getting a lot of getting everybody on board, a lot of solving these problems, these ecological collapses. If everyone did just one little thing to intercept their stormwater, we'd probably be experiencing better water quality. If everybody also just put a little pollinator garden, we might be getting some rebound on some of these threatened bees. It really comes from that kind of like shifting of the way that each property is used, because really like the whole land doesn't care where your boundary line ends, and it's kind of about getting together. That being said, there are a lot of programs going on, like the Mass DCR does the Green and Gateway Cities program, where they actually target like socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, and they actually will advertise free tree for your property. And they're actually doing this in Brockton, in different like different areas in Boston, and so it's a lot of outreach. And then they also hire crews for the summer. They going around in their trucks and their compost and planting trees in people's yards. So that's one thing that's already happening. But in terms of like doing it at a mass scale, like one big broad sweep, like afforestation or reforestation, like that gets into ownership of property and the different stakeholders and Starr, what should they do in certain areas, different easements, So that's what I would say.
It'll be easier under socialism.
Yeah, exactly.
This democracy is killing all the good stuff.
Going along with what you're saying, Ben, about these postage stamp lots that we have around here, private, something that I thought would be helpful, and that I remember when I was in Scottsdale visiting a friend in Arizona, and I don't know if it was all of Phoenix, well, it was a bit kind of city-ish, but out in Scottsdale, there was some incentive on your property to keep part of your property native. And not, because what I see around here, which in my neighborhood really bums me out, I just feel like every year I see more and more people just taking every bit of their property, whether they're using it or not, and like removing, well, it's not even always removing trees, but limbing the tree way up, removing the leaf litter, removing the scrubby native shrubs, and just either having that book of mowed, limbed up trees, or planting ornamentals under there. So I've often thought, in places like this, residential areas, there would be great advantage to, I guess some would be carbon sequestration, but also wildlife habitat ease, keeping portions of our backyards habitat, rather than feeling the need to mow to every corner of your lot, and put mulch over everything. And I don't know if something like that could exist, incentives for that.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to look at local zoning or some kind of incentive. Because I see the same thing where I live. It's kind of called the chainsaw system. Somebody buys a piece of land and they start chainsaw the great way.
Especially
around the trees, but everything else is.
Wetlands too. We have so many kettle ponds, which are vermipool habitat, and people don't realize, these frogs, these peepers that we all love to hear, they are only in those pools for 2 months out of their lives. It's this part of their lives, and they need the elements, they need the leaf litter, the shrubs.
You can get verticals certified.
Yeah, it still doesn't, it'll help.
Yeah, it puts a 100-foot radius around it, which is more than what the Conservation Commission usually wants.
A couple things. One, Madhavi, thank you so much for talking about values. It's really good to hear that. And my other question is just really specific. I'm trying to figure out this whole thing of, I need to learn more about not tilling to farm. Is there a website or something or somewhere I can get to understand that more?
I'll get back to you on that. Yeah, definitely. So, let me think about that, I'll mention that in a second, because I know there's something. But yeah.
Yes.
I really hear what you're saying. I mean, I live in Provincetown and all the people around me, clean up their lots to perfection. And, I'm just learning to leave the leaves down. But, I start to feel like white trash, I know that's a bad concept. Bad thing to say, but, I just feel like, I'm this hippie living amongst, and they probably look at my lawn and say, because I just learned about not picking up all the leaves, and I didn't know that before, I was just doing it myself. But, I know my neighbors are looking over there and saying, when is she gonna pick up the leaves, and so it is really about education, I'm 68 and I just learned, pick up the leaves, so it's really about educating our communities about how to.
What's attractive,
Yeah.
A sterile, hydrangea filled rhododendron green lawn is very unattractive to me because it's sterile.
Right.
Your yard would probably be more attractive to me. So we get into a second value.
I think the discussion of values is very important, but I think it's also very important that we talk